The tracking of a military catastrophe begins not with the roar of radial engines, but with the scratching of a pencil in a humid, dimly lit room. By January of 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army was bleeding out in the dense, malaria-ridden jungles of New Guinea. The bitter defeat at Guadalcanal had proved that the industrial might of the United States was turning the tide of the Pacific War. But the Japanese High Command refused to yield. To them, the key to holding the entire theater lay in a coastal stronghold called Leh. If Leh fell, the Allied forces under General Douglas MacArthur would have a direct, unobstructed highway to Rabaul, the nerve center of Japanese power in the South Pacific. The order from Tokyo was absolute. Leh must be reinforced at all costs. The men chosen for this desperate mission were the veteran soldiers of the 51st Division, nearly 7,000 troops who had been told they were going to turn the tide of the war. They packed into the dark, sweltering holds of 8 transport ships, surrounded by thousands of tons of aviation fuel, heavy artillery, ammunition, and medical supplies. Escorting this massive concentration of human cargo were 8 of the Imperial Navy's finest destroyers, commanded by Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, a seasoned sailor who understood the deadly nature of the waters he was about to cross. Kimura looked at the weather reports and saw his only chance of survival. A massive, slow-moving tropical storm front was rolling across the Bismarck Sea for a surface fleet. A typhoon is a dangerous enemy, but to Kimura, those heavy, low-hanging black clouds were a protective shield. No Allied scout plane could spot a convoy through a solid wall of tropical rain and zero-visibility fog. On February 28th, under the cover of a torrential downpour, the convoy slipped out of Rabaul. The Japanese soldiers on board cheered as the land faded into the gray mist, believing that the gods of the wind and rain were guiding them to victory. But they were sailing into a trap, engineered by mathematics and broken codes. Hundreds of miles away, in Brisbane, Australia, brilliant Allied codebreakers, working in deep secrecy, had already intercepted and decrypted the Imperial Navy's radio traffic. They didn't just know the convoy was coming. They knew the exact departure time, the speed of the ships, the number of troops on board, and the precise route Kimura intended to take. This priceless intelligence was handed directly to Lieutenant General George Kenny, the aggressive, unconventional commander of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenny was a man who detested traditional military dogma. He knew that if the 51st Division successfully landed at La, thousands of American and Australian soldiers would die trying to root them out of the jungle. The convoy had to be destroyed while it was still at sea, trapped in the deep water where numbers and armor meant nothing. Against gravity and high explosives, Kenny's problem was that traditional bombing methods were an embarrassing failure against moving naval targets. For the first 2 years of the war, heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress had flown at 20,000 feet, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance on maneuvering warships, only to see the bombs splash harmlessly into the ocean. From 4 miles up, a destroyer looks like a matchstick, and a sharp turn by an experienced captain can evade a bomb fell from that altitude with ease. Kenny knew that to kill a ship, you had to hit it from the side, not from above. He needed a weapon that could strike with the precision of a naval torpedo, but with the blistering speed of a land-based aircraft. Enter Major Paul Ibs Gunn, known to everyone in the Pacific as Pappy, a legendary, cigar-chomping pre-war aviator and mechanical genius. Gunn looked at the twin-engine B-25 Mitchell medium bomber and saw something the manufacturers never intended. He took the standard medium bomber, ordered his mechanics to strip out the heavy bombardier position from the nose, the glass canopy, and the bomb-aiming equipment, and replaced the empty space with solid blocks of heavy timber and steel. Into that rebuilt nose, Pappy Gunn packed 450 caliber heavy machine guns. He then bolted 2 more gun blisters to each side of the fuselage, giving the aircraft a total of 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns. When those guns opened fire simultaneously, they unleashed a wall of lead that could tear through a ship's superstructure like a chainsaw through plywood. The B-25 was no longer just a horizontal bomber. It had been transformed into a low-altitude strafing monster, a commerce destroyer designed to look an enemy captain right in the eyes before pulling the trigger. But firepower was only half the equation. To deliver the killing blow, Kenny and Gunn perfected a terrifyingly radical tactic known as skip bombing. The concept was deceptively simple, mimicking the way a child skips a flat stone across the surface of a still pond. A B-25 would drop down until its belly was nearly scraping the ocean waves, flying at over 200 miles per hour at an altitude of less than 100 feet. The pilot would line up on the broadside of an enemy ship and release a 500-pound bomb, equipped with a 5-second delay fuse. The bomb would strike the water, bounce high into the air, skip across the surface, and slam directly into the side of the ship's hull, detonating below the waterline or tearing into the engine rooms. It required nerves of steel. A single mistake meant the aircraft would catch its propeller on a wave and disintegrate into the sea, or fly directly into the mast of the target ship. For weeks, in the deep valleys of New Guinea and over sunken shipwrecks in Port Moresby, American pilots practiced this deadly dance, flying so low that their windshields were constantly coated in salty sea spray. They were honing a blade that was about to sever the jugular vein of the Japanese Army. As the morning of March 2nd dawned, the weather front that Admiral Kimura had relied upon began to fracture. The heavy storm clouds parted, revealing a brilliant, unforgiving blue sky over the Bismarck Sea. At 10 minutes to 10, a lone Australian Catalina flying boat spotted the convoy through a break in the mist. The trap was sprung. The first wave of attackers was not the modified B, but the heavy B-17 flying fortresses of the 5th Air Force, flying at high altitude. They rained heavy ordnance down upon the convoy, forcing Kimura's destroyers to scatter and turn, breaking their tight defensive formation. One transport ship, the Kyokusei Maru, took 2 direct hits and began to settle rapidly into the dark water. As her crew scrambled into lifeboats, 2 Japanese destroyers rushed to rescue the survivors. Separating themselves from the main body of the fleet, Kimura remained confident. His ships had survived the initial high-altitude onslaught with minimal casualties, and the remaining 7 transports were still moving forward toward their destination. He believed the worst was over, and that the cover of the approaching night would protect him the rest of the way to Leh. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on March 2nd, General Kenny was at his headquarters, looking at the radar charts and maps. He knew the exact position of every burning piece of wreckage and every surviving vessel. He knew that by the next morning, the convoy would be entering the narrow waters of the Huon Gulf, trapped between the coast of New Britain and the towering mountains of New Guinea. He called his commanders into the briefing room and gave the order for the entire Air Force to launch at dawn. Every operational aircraft in the theater was to fly out simultaneously in a massive, synchronized hammer blow. The pilots went to their tents, listening to the rain on the canvas, knowing that by noon the next day they would either be heroes or corpses at the bottom of the sea. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, began with a sound that shook the very earth of the north coast of New Guinea. More than 100 Allied aircraft rose from their hidden dirt airfields, gathering in the sky like a swarm of angry hornets. It was a masterpiece of complex tactical synchronization. At the highest level, flying at 20,000 feet, were the heavy B-17 bombers, designed to draw the attention of the Japanese Zero fighters and drop heavy ordnance to keep the ships evasive. Below them, at medium altitude, were B-25s and A-20 Havocs. But the true terror was coming from the deck, flying so low that they were invisible to naval radar, hidden by the curve of the earth and the coastal cliffs. Admiral Kimura's lookouts on the bridge of the flagship destroyer Shirayuki scanned the skies, expecting the traditional high-altitude formations. Instead, they heard a deep bass roar that resonated through the iron plates of their ships. Emerging from the morning haze, just feet above the Whitecaps, was a line of twin-engine aircraft coming at them with terrifying speed. The first to strike were the Bristol bow fighters of the Royal Australian Air Force. The Japanese sailors, accustomed to traditional bombing runs, assumed these low-flying aircraft were torpedo bombers. Following standard naval doctrine, the captains turned their ships directly toward the incoming planes to present the narrowest possible target profile. It was a fatal mistake. The bow fighters were not carrying torpedoes. They were packed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. As the Japanese ships lined up Buon, the Australian pilots pulled their triggers. A torrential storm of explosive shells raked the exposed decks of the transports and destroyers. Cannon fire shredded the unarmored superstructures, turned the wooden bridges into flying splinters, and obliterated the anti-aircraft gun crews before they could even adjust their sights down to the horizon, before the dazed Japanese crews could recover from the Australian strafing run. The modified B-25 Mitchells of the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ed Larner, roared into the heart of the convoy. They came in line abreast, roaring across the water at 250 miles per hour, flying below the level of the ship's masts. The sight was unlike anything the veteran Japanese sailors had ever witnessed. The noses of the American bombers erupted in a continuous, blinding flash of orange fire as their 8 heavy machine guns opened up. The 50 caliber rounds tore through the steel hulls of the troop transports, detonating ammunition crates and igniting fuel drums stored on the decks. The noise was a deafening combination of screaming engines, hammering machine guns, and the screech of tearing metal. Then came the bombs. Flying at masthead height, the American pilots waited until they were less than 300 feet from their targets before releasing their 500-pound payloads. The heavy ordnance slammed into the water, skipping gracefully across the surface like lethal toys before striking the hulls of the Japanese vessels. The results were instantaneous and catastrophic. One bomb skipped directly into the side of the transport Shanghai Maru, blasting open a massive hole below the waterline. The sea rushed into the engine room, rolling the ship onto its side within minutes. Another B-25 lined up on the destroyer Arashio, raking the bridge with gunfire, killing the captain and helmsman, and then skipping a bomb into her stern, blowing her rudder and propellers clean off the ship. The unguided vessel veered wildly out of control, slamming into the burning hulk of a troop transport in a horrific tangle of metal and fire. The Bismarck Sea had become a slaughterhouse. The sky was filled with black anti-aircraft smoke, white lines of tracer fire, and the massive plumes of water thrown up by skipping bombs. The Japanese Zero fighters in the sky were completely overwhelmed, unable to dive on the low-flying American bombers without risking crashing into the sea themselves, while American P-38 Lightnings dove from the clouds to tie them up in deadly dogfights. On the surface, the proud reinforcement convoy was disintegrating. The transport Kembu Maru, carrying thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, took a direct hit to its forward hold. A massive fireball erupted from the vessel, rising thousands of feet into the air and blowing the ship apart so violently that the concussion wave nearly knocked the attacking B-25s out of the sky. Soldiers packed into the holds of the transports never had a chance. They were incinerated by the blasts or trapped in the dark as the ships filled with water and plunged into the abyss. Admiral Kimura's flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, was targeted by multiple low-level bombers. A 50 caliber strafing run cut down the officers on the bridge, and a skipping bomb slammed directly into her aft ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion broke the destroyer's back, snapping the stern section away from the rest of the ship. Kimura, wounded and bleeding, was forced to abandon his sinking flagship and transfer his command to a surviving vessel. By mid-morning, the main phase of the attack was over, but the destruction was absolute. In less than 15 minutes of concentrated low-altitude violence, the core of the Japanese fleet had been erased. All 8 of the troop transports were either resting at the bottom of the sea or converted into drifting, burning infernos. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers had been sunk or were in the process of sinking. The tragedy, however, did not end with the sinking of the fleet. Thousands of Japanese survivors were left drifting in lifeboats, rafts, and on wooden debris across the vast expanse of the Huon Gulf. Allied commanders knew that if these men reached the shores of New Guinea, they could still reform into an effective fighting force and threaten the Allied lines. In a grim, controversial chapter of the Pacific War, Allied aircraft and PT boats were sent out over the next 2 days to systematically sweep the waters, destroying the remaining lifeboats and rafts. It was a cold, merciless application of total war, ensuring that the 51st Division would never fight again. When the final tallies were made, the scale of the Allied victory was staggering. For the loss of just 2 bombers and 3 fighters, the United States and Australian Air Forces had obliterated an entire Army division. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors lay dead at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining survivors, who were plucked from the water by rescue destroyers, were returned to Rabaul, stripped of their weapons, their equipment, and their morale. The strategic impact of the battle was immediate and permanent. Imperial Japanese headquarters in Tokyo was forced to accept a bitter, undeniable truth. They could no longer send slow surface convoys anywhere within range of land-based Allied air power. The lifeline to New Guinea was broken. From that moment on, reinforcements to the front lines had to be smuggled in by submarines or small wooden barges crawling along the coast at night. This drip feed of supplies was never enough to sustain an army, leaving Japanese garrisons across the Pacific to slowly starve and lose their cohesion. The low-altitude B-25 Mitchells and the daring pilots who flew them had not just destroyed a convoy. They had rewritten the rules of naval warfare and slammed the door on Japan's ambitions in the South Seas.